Welcome to Pastor's Chat today. Well, we're looking at a new psalm, Psalm 81. The title of this psalm says, "To the chief musician on an instrument of Gath, a psalm of Asaph." Now remember, Asaph wrote about 12 different psalms, but we believe these were different Asaphs, at least 3 different Asaphs that wrote these psalms that are grouped together. And they're probably grouped together because they all share some similarities as far as their presentation and the fact that they were written by an Asaph. Now, Asaph, remember, originally was one of the 3 chief musicians that David appointed to lead tabernacle temple worship there in Jerusalem after he became king. Then we know that there was another Asaph specifically that lived in the time of Isaiah and the time of the King Hezekiah. And then another Asaph lived and wrote during the time of Jeremiah the prophet and when the Babylonians had come in to destroy Jerusalem. And we read and have already talked about those psalms. But no doubt the Asaphs, the descendants of Asaph from David's time, became a guild of musicians that were a part of the Levite tribe that led in worship and encouraged people to worship. And now we believe this psalm here was written by, of course it says Asaph, a psalm of Asaph, but it was written by maybe an unknown Asaph, but someone who wanted to recount history and bring and call the people together to worship. And so definitely this is also categorized as a historical psalm because he reviews history and he puts it in a psalm, in a song to be sung so that the people of Israel would pass on to the generations to come their history of God's goodness and God's working in the midst of their people. And so we will read these first 5 verses and make a few comments. And so he says in verse 1, "Sing aloud to God our strength. Make a joyful shout to the God of Jacob." Now, apparently, as we read this, you notice immediately that it's a call to make a joyful shout to the God of Jacob. And we'll see in this passage that the God of Jacob is mentioned, the Joseph is mentioned, and Israel is mentioned. 3 different names for the nation of Israel. He says, "Raise a song and strike the timbrel, the pleasant harp with the lute." And so he calls the people to worship in verse 1. In verse 2, he's calling the musicians to get out their instruments and worship. And then he calls the priests to worship in verse 3. "Blow the trumpet at the time of the new moon, at the full moon on our solemn feast day." Now, there's different opinions as to the occasion for which Asaph wrote this. It could have been Passover that happened in March, April of our calendar year, in the Jewish year, the Passover, or it could have been written toward the end of the year, the civil part of the year that started with the Feast of Tabernacles. And maybe you notice that there's the Feast of Tabernacles combined with several other feasts, and we'll talk about this in our chat as we write it out today. But and you notice he says, "Blow the trumpet at the time of the new moon, at the full moon on our solemn feast day. This is a statute for Israel, a law of the God of Jacob." And so definitely in the law of Moses, which during the time of tabernacles, the book of Deuteronomy would be read. And that was part of the law. And it was a reminder, it was the review of the nation of Israel being born and what their journey through the wilderness as you read the book of Deuteronomy. And so it was a time, a stated time, a called time in the law to come and worship. God calls us to worship. We're to be worshipers every day individually, and that gives diversity. Can you imagine? Every person has a worship from their heart to God, but then there's a unity in worship when we come together with the other saints to worship the Lord. And so then he says, "For this he established in Joseph as a testimony when he went throughout the land of Egypt, where I heard a language I did not understand." So now that's referring back probably to Passover And it's when the people of Israel were in Egypt and they heard a voice they did not understand. And we'll talk about that tomorrow. Hey, well, God bless you. I trust that you will be going to a place of worship with God's people today with instruments and bring Him glory and praise, because that's what He calls us to do in these first verses. God bless, and you have a wonderful, wonderful day.